Hello, everybody. This is a seminar that is basically on how to identify trees and the trees of Tennessee. It's meant for the Tennessee Naturalist Program as well. It should fulfill that chapter or that section on trees and dendrology. Basically, I start out with Tennessee climate, geography, and I also add some trees that are associated with plants, insects, and wildlife. First of all, we'll talk about Tennessee and the land, how beautiful it is, and such a great place. If you're new to the area, you need to get out and just explore the Tennessee countryside and see the different, first of all, you'll notice the trees and the mountains and the valleys as well. Just a lot of things to see in Tennessee. What we're going to do is take a little tour from the west to the east, and we'll show the differences, first of all, in the soil, and then in the plant life and the trees. Also, we've got the land and the water. Basically, here's the different watersheds in Tennessee. If you don't know, it's basically where the water drains from. You know, it goes from high to low, and there's just so many small watersheds and larger watersheds. As you can see, there's basically the management groups in Tennessee. There's quite a few minor watersheds that you can see. Actually, if you go online, there's a place where you can actually find out the watershed that takes the water down to through your house, through your land. In the background, you can see a beautiful virgin falls on the Cumberland Plateau. Then, of course, the plants. We won't be talking too much about the plants. We'll be talking more about trees, but the plants of Tennessee are as diverse as the trees. So here's a beautiful look at what we'll probably see here in the next month or so in the understory of the forest. Some beautiful phlox and trilliums in the Smoky Mountains. Some of the plants we look forward to, there's the tulip poplar tree is a state tree of Tennessee. The purple passion flower is a beautiful flower, and that's the state's wildflower. And also there's cultivated flower, which is the Tennessee state flower, the iris. Add into that the insects, which are very instrumental in tree life as well. The firefly is our state insect. The lady beetle is also a state insect. The honeybee is the official state agricultural insect. And the zebra swallowtail was designated Tennessee's official butterfly. And all these things, the land, the water, the insects, and everything it's all interconnected, almost like the spider web. We have to understand the environment. It's important to understand all the parts of this. If we're going to even talk about the trees, we want to talk about the topography, which is the nature of the land, physical nature. We want to talk a little bit about the climate. That's going to make a difference on what trees grow where. The soil, of course, is going to be key. The plants, trees, and flowers all work together in this network of nature out there. And we have to think about the human history of the human influences that took place. It's been a long time. There's been different things that happened, maybe the forest fires, maybe all the housing. And as we've gotten a higher and higher population, it crowds out some of our beautiful nature areas. Some of the learning objectives for this seminar are gaining a deeper appreciation for the state of Tennessee by becoming more familiar with the geography and the soils and climate and how that impacts trees and smaller plants. We want to become familiar with the soil characteristics and plant species. to each of the three grand divisions, the west, the central, and the eastern, which are, and we'll talk about the grand divisions of Tennessee, and consider the characteristics of the sections or the provinces, or the, you know, the little subsection that you live in, and how each one of these, even your yard, might impact the bigger picture. And we'll be able to describe some of the ways humans have impacted our current Tennessee environment and vegetation. Tennessee has 95 counties. We're in Hamilton County, of course, and it borders 8 other states. The state is 440 miles long and 120 miles wide. If you've ever driven the roads, you know that it's a long state. It extends from the Mississippi River on the west to the Blue Ridge Mountains on the east. Total area is 26 million acres, or about 42,000 square miles. We're the 36th largest state, and we are 926 square miles are covered by water. So we've got quite a bit of water in our state. We're just a wonderful state to live in. There's the lowest elevation is 178 feet near Memphis, Shelby County. And the highest area is Sevier County, is Clingman's Dome. Just bringing it home a little closer, Chattanooga downtown elevation is about 680 feet. Lookout Mountain is our highest point. It's along the eastern brow. It reaches 2,300 feet. Signal Mountain is somewhat shorter. It doesn't seem like it too much, but it's 1,700 feet off high. So the topography. This is some of the topography. Like I said, it's the elevation. It's the rolling height and valleys. But the different things that can happen in the topography is the light. When you get in the narrow valleys, the light might have a hard time peeking through some of those areas. The north, south, east, and west aspect, the slope towards the sun rising, or the other way when it's setting, could make a big difference on what trees and plants might grow in that area. Also, the water, rainfall, and drainage. We talked about the water coming through the valleys. So the drainage and how it makes it through down to the rivers is important. And of course, light and temperature is going to make a big difference on the topography. Here's a nice little map of the Tennessee climate. When we go to the garden centers, we might look at our plant tags, and we'll notice that sometimes they're labeled with the plant hardiness zones. Plant hardiness zones are basically this down here, where, and there's a few more, but ours is basically 7A and 7B. And that means that our lowest temperature, our average extreme minimum temperature, and it's from, and 7A is the cooler part. That's probably the Signal Mountain, Lookout Mountain area. It gets down to 0 to 5. Whereas the valleys here in downtown Chattanooga and most of the areas are going to be a little higher, a little warmer, not much. But what this means is just a rough and dirty way to gauge what can grow here. If we look back over here, and I don't see any blue, but the green in Tennessee, it's around Cookeville there, you'll see that that's a little bit cooler, -10 to -5. So what all this means, and if we got up into higher, we would get maybe into the blue 5B, and that would mean a lot of those plants either would grow or wouldn't grow. Some plants, some trees like it cooler, some plants like it warmer. Down in Georgia, or as we get down into Florida, those might get into the tropical areas. Now, as the world is getting warmer and warmer, sometimes we might be able to grow some of our plants and maybe some of the trees more like we would in the northern Georgia area, which would be 10 to 15. So this is, like I said, just a rough and dirty map with the plant hardiness zones. Tennessee has pretty much, it's very blessed with a lot of rainfall compared to many other states and many other areas. We have 46 to 50 inches, kind of roughly 50 inches, we also have more rain up in the peaks of the mountains, but generally about 50 inches if you average it out, which is kind of nice. We don't get all that much snowfall, which is kind of nice, but it's nice to see a little bit of snow. They do get it up in the mountains, but we usually get 2 to 4 inches in Chattanooga. Can't remember when we had our snowfall last. We might get some this year, but Nashville might get a few more. Memphis is about like us when it comes to snowfall. Some of the other things that add to the climate in Tennessee is the summer heat. We know that if you've been here a few seasons, you know that the heat of the summer can start in June, July, but usually July, August, September, and even October can be pretty hot. Maybe not as hot as it gets in the south, but we do have that summer heat. And there is a bit of wind occasionally, which can add to the climate. The moisture distribution, sometimes we get all our rain in the spring, it seems. We get if we talk about the 50 inches of rain overall, we might get 30 or 40 of that just in the spring. And so we get problems with erosion. It all comes down at once. And the rate of seasonal change. A lot of times, if it gets real dry, sometimes the trees can change color quicker than we would normally see. But some of that seasonal change is because of the heat and the moisture that occurs over our summer. And then we've got what they call microclimates. And it's just, we talk about those climates on the big scale. We may have a huge drought in our area, but if we have let's say a yard that we can water, then we can reduce that climate or that area. So we call that a microclimate. Maybe we can plant our trees on one side of the house that's not going to get that heat, or we'll be able to, like I say, water it and avoid some of the basic climates by finding these microclimates. And some of these microclimates occur even in nature. In the valleys, for instance, where certain trees or plants are shaded by other plants, they're going to make it through some of the droughts and the heat of the summer. So there's local climatic conditions. There's the light changes, the wind could be variable, depends if you're on a higher part of the slope, or the humidity can make a difference. And this usually is the result of the hills, valleys, and slopes that we have around Tennessee. Let's talk about our soils. This is where we'll start from the bottom and work our way up. Soils form due to several factors. There's the parent material, it's called, and basically this is called the stuff or the materials where soils develop, including minerals and rocks. If you think about the ball of the earth, there's the bedrock that has to weather and turn into soil-sized particles. This takes a long time. Some people, have put this into the 1,000-year range, where this takes a long, long time. Some soils can be blown from other regions directly over top of the bedrock, so those soils might form a little quicker. Many soils form in materials transported and deposited by glaciers, gravity, wind, rivers, lakes, or oceans. Our climate is a factor in making soil. Temperature, wind, rain, snow, of course, can freeze and thaw. The rain can weather things down. The wind can blow soil from one place to another over time. The topography makes a big difference too. Out in the flat areas, the wind can blow more readily. If it's near a waterway, the floods and the rains will cause the more soil, different type of soil to build up. And the organisms in the soil can make a big difference on what kind of soil that is. The fungi and the bacteria and the other microorganisms, the worms and the creatures that are inside the soil, or actually are encouraged to be inside the soil, can make a big difference on how well. It's almost like a slow compost pile going on. And then the time, often it takes thousands of years for soil to develop, at least the type of soil that we've seen in our land. Sometimes in our gardens, we think we can make soil quickly by going to the garden center and buying certain parts of what we need, but in nature, that has to take place naturally. The soil comes from basically from different places. Here we see upland is going to be a little different, probably because of erosion and wind, and just the gravity is taking the soil down the side slope to maybe a foot slope, which is just above a terrace, possibly. We'll talk about some of our plateaus in Tennessee, and then it might go down into a valley where there could be possibly a floodplain. And so there's going to be different trees that will like this down here versus trees that will like this up here. All the way through, there'll be different types of trees. Here's some of the soils. These are just basic soils that are across the Tennessee regions. And here we've got 9 different types of soil. And we'll go through each one of these, but basically we start at the Mississippi River, the floodplains. Over and over, the Mississippi River is flooded, and that certainly made the plains quite a bit different. There's an area in region 2 where it's deep, and that's where you see a lot of the soybean and cotton fields over there. A lot of agriculture, soybeans are growing quite heavily, even in number 3, where it has shallow. We'll talk about lows, it's basically a wind deposit. Then we get into the Highland Rim, which is 4. So then 5 is a sort of a basin, and that's where Nashville is. Then we get over into 6, which is the Cumberland Plateau area. And then this little slice of heaven, if you might say, is called the Sequatchie Valley. That has its own soil makeup. Then we got number 8, which is the Ridge and Valley. This is kind of where we're at right here in Chattanooga. We've got some ridges and valleys. Then there's the west slope of the Appalachians. This is where the higher mountains are, and some of the different trees that grow over there. So now we went through all the soils, and now let's take a look at some of the trees and plants that can grow in these areas. So here were the 9 soils that we covered, and let's go through a little bit over an A again, on right by the Mississippi River. And there's a southern floodplain forest. We'll talk about some of the plants or trees that can live in or are known to be there. Then there's the oak hickory forest in B, the river valleys or the drainage right there. And then oak hickory pine as you get in over here into the C categories. There's one there. So a lot of pine forests, not big ones like they would have in Mississippi and in Alabama, but quite a bit of the loblolly pines are up in that area right there. Then we get into D is oak hickory again, but there's more prairie type land. That would be, where's a D? I guess up there's a little bit of a D over there. So some of that oak hickory turned into sort of a prairie. And then the Cedar Glades is right around Nashville. It's just next to Nashville. And that's we'll show some of the interesting things. Not a lot of high or big trees. And that's where a lot of the cedars are. And there's some very, very interesting plants that occur in that cedar type glade. Then there's the mesophytic forest, which means basically a middle dryness of the forest is an F right there. G is the Appalachian oak, a lot more oak trees primarily in that area. Then there's the northern hardwoods, and then we start to get into spruce and fir along that edge. So anyway, yeah, a lot of different ones, and we'll go through quite a few of these coming up. You put all these together into the water, the soil, the temperature, and you get the different trees that can do well in these areas, these communities. Some of the couple of the terms you need to know, and you may know a little bit already. Xeriscaping means growing things in dry environments. We have the mesic, which is moderate moisture, and then the hydro means moist environments. Those are near the streams or where it gets plenty of rainfall. Tennessee water, here's how it looks from that standpoint. The xeric is the oak, pine, hickory up there on the higher elevations, where the mesic might be on the slopes. You'll see oaks, beech, sugar maple, tulip poplar in that area. Down in the valley, where it could be near a creek, where it could have more moisture, you'll see another diversity of plants. Maybe the sugarberry, the elms, the green ash may grow where it's hydric. And then over here on the other side is the oak, pine, hickory again. Maybe you're back up on the higher parts there again. So that's just a basic diagram of some of the things to look for. And some of the flora, which are the flowering plants, they're known to be in specific areas. We could take some of that flora and do it in our backyards, but if we're going to go look at some of these areas ourselves, we have to look where the soils and the water and everything comes together in a certain area to be able to see certain flowers, wildflowers especially. And a lot of this, it's ever changing, and a lot of it's been impacted by farming, mining, people, exotics, in plants or even animals that come in from other places. Global warming is causing a lot of problems, and climate changes. When you talk about the Tennessee flora, which trees are part of that, there's 2,878 species of all those. There's about over a little bit 400 of them are non-native. So, and non-native means they just came in from other places. It doesn't mean that they're invasive all the time. It just means that they weren't originally in our area, probably 100 years ago or so. There's certain criteria that people use for native and non-native. When it comes to trees, there's almost 200 species, which means they're separate individual types. If you went to a garden center, you might see different types of trees, which are called cultivars. Species are the kinds, and then cultivars are maybe a certain species might have 1 to 50 cultivars. And what they mean is somebody took those or found a different color, different leaf shape, a different type of just a different something that made it a little different in their species. Maybe it can grow a little bit easier in our area. Now we're going to get into the the 3 divisions of Tennessee, and this is imprinted on our beautiful flag with the 3 stars. They adopted this flag in 1905. It represents the 3 grand divisions, West, Middle, and East Tennessee. They're pure white, representing 3 grand divisions. The stars are bound together by a circle of blue, and the symbol means that they're just bound together in one trinity. So it has a pretty nice symbol of Tennessee. Here's on the scale of the divisions, and we kind of divide the state up this way because there's different topography. We already talked about how flat it is over here, kind of moderately hilly in the central, and then how it gets really elevated over here, the mountains and the valleys and that sort of thing. So we're going to take these piece by piece and go through and show some of the differences in trees that occur in these different places. We'll be talking about West Tennessee is basically the coastal plain province. We've got the Mississippi River section, which is a place called Reelfoot Lake, which is up in this area, somewhere in this area right here. And Reelfoot Lake is interesting because it was back in the old days, there was a time when there was an earthquake, and the river, the Mississippi River that normally runs down this way from north to south, the earthquake stopped the river and made it flow south to north for a while, and that's when it formed Reelfoot Lake. I don't know all the details of that, but it's very interesting that that's where Reelfoot Lake is. And now you can go to Reelfoot Lake and you can take a flat bottom boat and get out there and paddle around and see some of the beautiful what am I called, bald cypress trees with their knees. And knees are basically short roots that pop up out of the ground. I'll show, I think I got a picture coming up here. And then there's Memphis that sits up on a bluff. If it was not up on a higher elevation, somewhat higher, it would get flooded all the time, but it's kind of protected a little bit from those floods that happen once in a while. Then there's the lower Tennessee River Valley section. We'll talk a little bit about all these. So let's go over to that Mississippi River Valley. It has deep soils made up of gravel, sand, silt, and clay. So that means they really have some nice agricultural soils over there. So they're well drained, some clay. Well, there's some clay and poorly drained ones, but by and large, there's silt, a lot of silt over there and sand. Here's those cypress knees I was talking about. The trees are probably right here. And then these are the roots that pop up. And even if the area flooded, these roots would provide oxygen to the tree, so the tree wouldn't die. They can basically live right through a month long or even longer wetness period. They're very prone to wet areas. They store flood water. These forested areas, they store flood water. They recycle nutrients. They prevent sediments and other waste from reaching open streams and rivers. So all these trees that are around these waterways do all these things to prevent erosion. Not only land erosion, but nutrient erosion. Some of the bottom hardwoods they call in this area. Some of the wettest areas, you'll see that bald cypress. There's one called water tupelo, river birch, sweet gum, sycamore, black willow, overcup oaks, and cherry bark oaks. So we'll talk about the oaks in a while and basically show that the different types of oaks that can occur in different areas. So it shows that here's the overcup and the cherry bark oaks. Some of the areas where there's less flooding would be the swamp chestnut, white cherry bark, overcup oak, slippery elm, red maple, shellbark hickory, silver and red maples, greenack box elder, and sugarberry. So even though it's wet, there's less flooding and a pretty good diversity of trees. Probably not just these, but many, many other trees that can live in this area. But sometimes these are the focus trees that occur the wettest. We know basically that willows just love water, bald cypress, sycamores love water. Even in our area, we can see some of these trees. I don't know if we see tupelo around here much. We see river birch, sweet gum, sycamore, willow, some of the oaks. And we see elms, maples. We see a lot of these trees in our area here in Hamilton County, but maybe not to the extent that you would see over there. So here's where we get over a little bit. We're still in the West Division, but we're in soils that are a little bit different. They're deep and shallow. These are silt deposited by wind, And there's these areas where there were marine deposits. So this was a big saltwater ocean right now. And 11% of the state. So this is where we see a lot of the agriculture, a lot of the bigger agriculture that occurs, the cotton growth or the cotton fields. There's oak hickory forest in this area. So the oak hickory forest, definitely, it just doesn't mean that there's just oak and hickory, but it means that there's a certain group of trees that are more likely to be in this area. Here we got these different oaks, chestnut, and black oaks, pignut, mockernut, hickories, different hickories. And on the driest and sandy slopes, you'll start to see some pine trees. In this case, the loblolly pine. You'll also see the black gum, which is it's native black gum. It's often called the tupelo tree, the black tupelo. And these are very instrumental for insects. They attract 45 different types of bees and other insects. So that's very beneficial. I've read where oak trees too are just amazing when it comes to supporting wildlife with their acorns, to their flowers support a lot of insects that either feed on them or help pollinate them. Even though or at least eat the pollen, they may not contribute that much because a lot of them are wind pollinated, the oak trees, but they're supporting a lot of wildlife and creatures that are inside the canopy of that tree. Now let's move over to Division 2, and basically we're now in the middle of the Tennessee, Nashville vicinity. We know that Nashville is known for country music and all the other musics now, not just country, but different things. I lived there for quite a bit of time, and so I got to see some of these areas. You'll see that here, it's Nashville's probably right in this area, right in this bowl, and a basin, maybe you'd say. Whereas if you looked around, you wouldn't see higher mountains, but you'd just say, wow, that's a little higher land. They call it the Highland Rim and the Eastern Highland Rim. We'll talk about these two rims here. The Western Highland Rim is a broad plateau, and it's tilted from east to west. That means it's tilted this way a little bit to west. So the sun rises in the east and sets in the west. So it's going to get that early morning sunlight right there. And that's going to make a little difference on the trees. It drains to both the Tennessee and the Ohio River. So there's primarily limestone, gravel, and shale. Back in the day, there were a lot of iron mining in 1800s to early 1900s. There were blast furnaces, which those furnaces needed wood to produce charcoal. So a lot of them were decimated back in 1873. So a lot of these forests are going to be what they call the second growth forest or the third growth. We talked about the phosphate mining that was south of Nashville in Maury County, which is in the Columbia region. There was phosphate and lime. They were formed from limestone with clay soils and some of that chert. So there were more tillable northward and more forested southward. So more forest down here, more tillable in the northern part of this. Here's a place that living in Nashville for a while, I knew that if someone had a piece of land that they didn't do anything with, they bought, let's say, 5 acres and they put their house on 1 acre, within a short period of time, within a year, they would start getting, everything would be little cedar trees. We have that happen here too in Hamilton County. It doesn't take long for cedar trees to pop up, and eventually they'll take over. It's a pretty nice tree. However, it's kind of considered a scrub tree. It's got some wildlife value. Here's an area that's north of Nashville into Kentucky. They call it the Pennyroyal Plains. I don't think I've ever been there, but they also call it the Big Barrens because it's mostly just grassy cover. You'll see that there's trees around the area too. It has what they call karst soils, which are limestone, dolomite rocks, and which can be dissolved with water. So there's going to be caves and sinkholes in this area. We went caving when we lived over there, and able to go in some of these areas because of this, because they were basically, the rock was dissolved and turned into caves and sinkholes. This is a native grass called little blue stem, which is prominent, was prominent in that time. And a lot of these areas have been converted to farmland now. So this is probably the closest thing to prairie land that you might think about in Kansas out there. So very beautiful land, but just not very mountainous and hilly, but still pretty nice. You know, just north of this area right here, north of the rim into Kentucky. So on the eastern side of this rim over here, there's these soils called karst. It's strongly acidic and low fertility. I think we said that the other side was basically phosphate and lime, which is, well, some of those soils were acidic too. There's loess, which means on some of the ridges or the flat area, you're going to have some good soil for farming and for other things to grow. A lot of forest, some tillable land in Cannon, Coffee, and Warren counties. Cannon is a little bit to the west of Nashville. Warren is the place where a lot of trees are grown. They call it the cradle of the nursery industry. And a lot of, I would say, German people, German history came from Europe and ended up settling in Warren County, Coffee County. And basically that's where they said, well, they found that they could plant a lot of different species of trees. So they call this the cradle of the nursery industry. There's a lot of oak forest there, a lot of cliffs, a lot of cedar, a lot of different oaks. And again, good in the valleys, good places to grow just an abundance of different trees. And it was due to those folks coming over and finding that land that turned it into such a hotbed of tree growing over there. Here's the outer basin. It's 5,500 square miles in total. There's steep hills and narrow valleys, again, chert and shale. Now, many of the soils here are basic, which means they're not acid. They're on the other end of the spectrum when it comes to pH. A lot of these were carved out of limestone, and some of them are well drained. So there's a gradual difference in the soils that you go through Tennessee. Not a huge difference, but just a small difference can make a difference in the trees and the types of understory. You can see here a lot of ferns, a lot of wild ginger. I think that's what that is. And just you'll see an understory of some of the pines. So a lot of different trees. The inner basin has poor drainage. A lot of the forests are cedar, hackberry, blue ash, white ash, all these different kinds of oaks, Shumard, white, and red oaks. And there's one section in that area. It's called the inner basin, and it's almost like a subsection. We're in the Middle Valley. It's just north of, or just northeast of Nashville, where it has rock, gravel, soil. It's very shallow soil. Some of them are only 2 inches deep. So basically trees don't survive. The cedar trees do, but most other trees don't make it. The oak trees and all those. They can survive long droughts, but that's only certain species that are going to make it, because most of the time nothing else will survive. So what can survive in these areas during the drought? That's what it's trying to say. And mosses and lichens and some of the herbaceous vegetation. Cedars can do pretty good. It's home to some of the interesting wildflowers that can only grow there. Tennessee coneflower is a very popular one. I'll show that in a second. And the Tennessee milkvetch. Here's that milkvetch. I don't think we use it that much for a wildflower, but it could be. It fixes nitrogen, meaning it has these structures on its roots that can grab onto the nitrogen and hold it, bring it into the soil for things for its own purposes and for other plants. It's in the bean family. It's native. Here's the Tennessee coneflower. Nowadays, you can buy these seeds at the garden center or online, and you can have them in your own yard, but you may have to look to this area to say, why are they growing so good in this area? And so it's probably because of the limestone. It's you'd have to read and see if it needs acid or basic. I'm not sure. I think it needs a more acid soil, but be good to look it up to see, just to kind of, they'd probably grow good in our yards. And it's a pretty neat thing to have because it is pretty native to our Tennessee area and actually native to that Cedar Glade area. Let's move to the east Grand section. So here we're getting closer to home. The Cumberland Plateau is a very neat area because it's basically it's higher elevation than we have it in Chattanooga. So let's look at that. It's an old plateau. It's in Tennessee sections which did not have a glacier here. A lot of our areas were formed because there was glaciers through here. There's Fall Creek Falls, which is a beautiful, beautiful waterfall. If you've never been there, there's a place called Cross Mountain. I don't think I've been there, but the elevation is 2,000, 3,500. I guess that's the highest one there. There's Sequatchie Valley, which we talked about, is a typical area. It has some not unique, but trees that are probably a different makeup than some of the other areas: red maple, black gum, holly, oak, basswood, ash, buckeye, and hickory. So you'll see just a different flavor of that. 22 counties. Let's see. Pretty cool area. What I know about it is that folks who basically, people that want to retire to Tennessee, they love Tennessee rolling mountains, but they like it up there because the temperature is, you get the waterfalls and the nice areas. Plus it's cooler. It might be 10 to 15 degrees cooler in the summertime. Very nice area, maybe compared to Chattanooga. I still like Chattanooga better myself, but a lot of people choose the Cumberland Plateau for that reason. There's a beautiful garden at our research station up there in Crossville. This is a picture of it. Some of the farms are over here, but the garden was made by master gardeners and other people over here. There were cold beds back then. There's shallow acidic lands in the upland areas. So a lot of history went on back then, and a lot of things carry on right now. It's got some agriculture, but it has some limitations just because of the sandstone over shale. Now we'll move over to, still in the eastern region, or the eastern Grand Division. We're up a little higher than what we're included in this area. It goes from New York all the way to Alabama. It has this ridge and valley system. We could even call it the Tennessee River Valley. That's why a lot of our banks and beekeeping groups are called the Tennessee Valley beekeepers, for instance. It has soils with limestone, shale, marble. It's known for high quality marble. Wow. Some of the limestone is deeper than shale. And again, there's numerous springs and caves on this side of the state. The Valley and Ridge, just bring it home a little bit. White Oak Mountain is between Chattanooga and Cleveland. There, back in the days, about 1900 and 1940, there was a beautiful tree called the American chestnut. And there was a fungus that wiped that out. I'll show some pictures coming up. Right now, the white oaks are dominant. Back in the day, American chestnut, which is a type of oak, got wiped out, and it made more space for the white oaks. There's also black, red, post, etc. Lots of different oak trees. There's different hickory trees. There's a good number of pines, still cedar and sassafras, tulip poplar, which is our state tree, red maple. So beautiful, beautiful area. And then we get over a little higher elevation, call it the Appalachian Highlands. Move my picture out of the way. And we get up into the mountains where the a lot of historical lore with Cherokee Indians. They named it, I guess that was the name for the Smoky Mountains, the Anakas. Great Smoky Mountains. There's different other mountain ranges, the Roan, Chiloe, English Mountains. 500,000 acres in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. I don't know if it's the biggest one, but it's the most well-attended national park during the spring and other times when the flowers are out and the trees are coming out. It'll be bumper to bumper, so you really have to watch when you go there not to get caught in the crowds, but it's worth the visit at almost any time of the year. Down a little bit southern near us is the Cherokee National Forest that has 650,000 acres. So that's a pretty good chunk of property as well. 20,000 species of plants in there and animals within its borders. And these are the Appalachian Mountains, so they're not as steep and as jaggedy as the Rocky Mountains, but I think that's what makes them more fun to be in, because you don't have to drive up so high, and we got definitely the humidity and the water that just causes so many different diversity of trees in this area and plants. We're known to have as much diversity as any other place in the world, especially in the United States, but even in the world, we're one of the most diverse landscapes. Especially in these places like coves. If you've ever been to Cades Cove, you know what I mean. It's just sort of a pocket where people found this was mountain area, but they found this little area where there was fertile and deep limestone soils in these valleys. And so they built log cabins here and just formed, there's parkland now, and it's a beautiful area it was very productive farmland. So it was just a beautiful place to go. And that's where all these tiny little farms still are. There's mixed hardwoods in these cove areas. Mixed meaning there's beech, poplar, sugar maple, white oak, buckeye, basswood, cucumber tree, silver bell, hemlock. This is below 4,200 feet. So you can often see certain trees above or below a certain elevation, which also gets back to those soils and the topography we talked about in the first part of this talk. So here we are still in the side over there, and eastern Grand Region. This is at the very top of one of those areas. Clingman's Dome, which is the highest, is 6,600 feet above sea level. There's these areas where you just don't see very high trees, but around the edges you might see some taller forests. But here you'd see these beautiful rhododendron areas, laurel type plants. Again, a spring bloom or a late spring bloom, you'll see these beautiful flowers in these areas. And that means that the soil, it's going by the soil and the climate and the elevation, they wouldn't grow at a lower, they wouldn't grow as well at a lower elevation. And the diversity of wildflowers. This is an area, I'm not sure, I guess it was after that fire in 2016. They wanted to see how the forest would respond. And the trees may take a while to come back, but the first thing to come back after a forest fire would be the flowering plants. A lot of those plants are made to survive a catastrophe like that, a fire. And so some of the pine trees, for instance, maybe other trees as well, need an occasional burn. That was the way that it did it back in the day, thousands of years ago, before human interruption, you might say, or human colonization. Forests went through cycles, and a lot of them had to do with fire. Fire was a natural thing. So sometimes forest folks will have a subscribed burn and cause that to happen so that they can renew certain parts of the forest. Actually, understandably, they can't do a whole widespread renewal like that because there's too many houses in the area. But if they could, that would rejuvenate the forest in a lot of cases, a lot of ways. And there's a lot of diversity again of the wildflowers here. You'll see golden seal, ginseng. Some of these flowers in the past have been harvested. They're not even supposed to be harvested in natural parks, but maybe if someone has a forest, they'll go in and harvest these. I know there's people who make little farms on these things. Sometimes they make the farm inside the forest. Sometimes they do it near the forest. But basically, we want to protect our wildflowers. So we're not. It's against the law, basically, to take anything out of a natural forest. So you want to preserve the native populations of a lot of these flowers. Here's one too that's been harvested, again, against the law. Going into the Smoky Mountain National Park and taking any of these things is definitely against the law. Because chances are, as well, if you did or if they did, and they sold it to people or they took one and brought it home, it would not grow in their yard. And it wouldn't grow not only because the soil isn't right, like we were talking about, but the organisms. There's different mycorrhizae, different relationships, insects that cause this to only grow in certain areas. So you have to have you have to have the right soil, and you have to have a lot of it to make them work. So in summary of this section anyway, our state has a beautiful and diverse landscape, and it's worth our study. It's been impacted by humans and natural problems, fire, but the environment is resilient and responds well to protection and appropriate use. So going forward, our understanding of all these plants and geography will help us improve our own landscapes and leave us a better natural legacy for future generations. We're always, I think most people taking any class, learning about this, will agree with me that there's a lot to be done. Even in our local area, we can protect trees from subdivisions, from different harvest practices, and be our good stewards of our property. Thanks to Dr. Natalie Bumgarner. She's our state urban horticulturalist, and she put together some of the slides, quite a few of those slides previously that we talked about. But let's go on to another section of our day here. I call it the secret life of trees. And let me move this out of the way. The tallest, most massive, longest living organisms ever to grow on Earth are trees. I think somewhere up in Michigan, there's I want to say a aspen grove that has a lot of little aspens growing, but the roots go out, I don't know how many miles or how many areas. It is the biggest organism. There might be other ways of looking at how big an organism is, but all the roots are intertwined, all the roots are connected. So if you look at it that way, you can look at massive redwoods or sequoias out in California, which are just amazing. But here, you don't have to go too far just to see some of these sites just by looking up when you go into our beautiful Tennessee forests. Here's a little bit about Hamilton County, our ecoregions. We're basically in the eastern broadleaf forest, and it has some oceanic backgrounds. Province. Let me move this out. There's the loblolly shortleaf pine forest types, which the pines, loblolly, shortleaf, southern red pines, they're in combination a lot of times. They comprise the most of the stocking. Common associate, some of the other things that might occur in these would be some oaks, hickories, and gum trees, sweet gum or black gum. Then there's the oak pine forest, which hardwoods dominate or comprise the plurality. But where pine and cedar come in at 25 to 50% of the stocking. So some of those combinations would be the oak pine and some of the gum trees, again, hickory and yellow poplar. Most of the ones that I see in our area are the oak hickory, and they're in the upland, more of the drier or the semi-dry areas. They're in singles or combinations, and they're the most common. There could be some pine trees intermixed. That's what I look out on Lookout Mountain right now, and I see mostly the oak hickory, but I also see there's quite a few pine trees intermixed there. So there's going to be yellow poplar, elm, maple, and even an occasional black walnut you'll probably see in some of these areas. If you've ever taken a little trip up the valley around Chattanooga, you'll notice that there's a place called the Tennessee River Gorge. The Tennessee Aquarium used to have a boat that went up through there, and I don't know if it still does, but you could either drive a road and get closer there. You could go over to the power plant on Moccasin, or what is it? Moccasin Bend, or what was that? What's the name of that power plant? You can go up. There's a lot of places where you can overlook this area, this Tennessee River Gorge, and see such a beautiful. Signal Mountain has a lookout that looks out over this. Or if you're fortunate to take a boat through here and see the River Gorge. And most of these are going to be the oak hickory forest type. From space, here's a good picture of where we're at. And if you look through here, you can see we just got done talking about the river over here. You can see the greenery where there's probably more agriculture, and then it gets rockier. Some more, this is the Tennessee River going back north right here. I think that's it. Nashville's about right in here. That's where the Basin is. Then the plateau. There's the valley again, the green. There's the Sequatchie Valley, that little finger that sticks up in there. Chattanooga's about right there, right at the base of mountains. Knoxville's up and through here. So you can see, yeah, here's the river. See how the river starts up in Virginia, and it flows down through Knoxville, goes into Chattanooga, goes into Alabama, and then it circles back up, and it goes up into Kentucky. So, and there's land between the lakes up there, and then the Mississippi River still goes north to south, but a very windy river. So that's just, it's nice to look at Tennessee on a map like this. Some of the Tennessee forests cover 15 million acres. There's 52% of the state's land areas. That's pretty impressive. About 89% of the trees are hardwoods. So, and there's mostly oak hickory forest. That's about 73%, or the almost 10 acres of land is in that oak hickory. They're aging. There's a greater percentage of acres that have trees in the mature over age class than in the immature. I talked to one of our UT foresters recently, and he said that we're not in herd of extra trees. He understands that people like to get out and plant trees, which is fine, but basically the trees that we have could survive, could be enough for all our needs with building houses and construction, things like that. But they need to be managed better. The trees, if they're aging and people aren't taking care of their forests, there's a lot of scrub trees that get involved. And so there's not, people need better education of how trees should be managed in the forest. And it takes quite a bit of knowledge. Fortunately, someone who owns some land could get that benefit or could get that help from one of these foresters. There's either foresters for hire, or you can take classes to learn how to better manage forest, all the way from cutting it properly, maybe prescribed burns, fertilizing it, weed control, insect control, all those things. We own a little bit of land like that down in Alabama, and we have to hire a person who will help us make some of those decisions. So harvest and wood manufacturing uses about 1/3 to half of the wood grown in Tennessee each year. So there's a continuous planting, regrowth, and harvesting. So here's the natural mortality that happens with the tree growth. And Tennessee is among the top 3 hardwood lumber producing states. That's amazing for a small little state. And that means that we not only have a lot of nice industry, but we have a really good diversity of hardwoods. We have a lot of different ones. We have a lot of top quality black walnut, a lot of top quality tulip poplar for the flooring industry. And we got quite a few pine trees for different things. Excuse me. Here's the types of forest in Tennessee. The oak hickory, we said it was almost 3/4. There's pine. There's those bottomland hardwoods over on the western side of the state, and then oak pine. Now the forest ownership in Tennessee is interesting. Industry only really owns 8.6%. The federal owns about 7.7%. State owns 3%, but who owns the rest? Wow, that means the private landowners own 80%. So it's good to have some property like that, but it's good to know how to manage it so that you can not only just provide for yourself and for wildlife. That's what we basically just the enjoyment of having some trees in our yard. But in some cases, it's nice to know how to manage it so that you can maybe have a harvest or do something with it. Some of the benefits of trees: they combat greenhouse effect, which means they clean the air, they provide oxygen, they cool streets, they conserve energy, they prevent water pollution by the roots holding the water, and the soil pollution or erosion. They provide food for basically us and for wildlife, basically, or more usually for wildlife. They provide the wood, not only just for heating, but the wood for all our industries. And they increase property values if they're spaced or if they're placed in the right way. Sometimes if they're overhanging your house, then it might not be such a great thing to have. The structure of the tree has parts to it. Basically, we know some of these parts already. We know that there's a big trunk of the tree that goes down the center. Then there's branches, and there's little smaller twigs. And the whole top part is called the crown. And the part that's just right there, maybe 6 feet above, is called the bole. And then down below, there's a taproot. Most trees don't have a really long taproot. They might have a short taproot, and this might go down 3 feet at the most. But then a lot of them will have their roots that come off from the tree. And then there'll be root hairs, these tiny little hairs on the roots. And that's where the nutrients will be taken in through the trees. So during a drought, or during, usually during a dry time or even a wet time, if something happens to those little root hairs, they dry out, or let's say they flood the tree and those little root hairs get rotted off, that can affect the life of that tree, especially if it's getting bigger and bigger, and then they have a flood or a drought. And that's what happened. That's what happened to a lot of the trees just a couple years ago when we had almost a late summer drought, and a lot of the trees were suffering. Sometimes they can recover, sometimes they cannot recover. There's different shapes of the tree. I'm always jealous of people who can go down the street. I can do it a little bit, but some folks, foresters, can look from a distance and go, yeah, that's a willow tree. I can see that one. Most of us, a willow tree. And a white oak tree, pretty definitive on what that might look like. So if we're talking about identifying trees, this is the first step. Just what they look like from a distance, and just from experience, you get to know certain trees. Some of the other things that we could use for identification, if you ever think back in high school, maybe you had to have a collection of leaves. That was one way to identify them, and we'll use that today a little bit to identify trees. But then if you ever took a class, or I'm telling you right now that flowers really help, and fruit. You can look at this and go, wow, that's dogwood flowers. Actually, the flower is right there in the middle. These are just structures. They're not called flowers. They're actually leaves, special type of leaf called a bract. But then other things to identify. Bark is a real prominent one that you use for identification. Again, jealous of those who can go out in the wintertime when there's no leaves, look at the bark and identify what tree it is. Location helps, like we were just talking about location. If you were up in the Cedar Glades, you would probably put that in your memory bank and say that tree is only grown in the Cedar Glades. We talked about shape and the size, another shape, the smell. Sometimes when you take a tree and scratch its bark, sometimes you can get a smell. Even taste is often used. Sometimes used, not often, but sometimes. And then a twig. Often you can look at a twig and go, this twig has opposite little buds, whereas some other one might have one there and one coming out up there. They would be alternate. We'll talk about that here in a second for identification. Let's look at this tree. We see a nice trunk going straight up. That's usually the trunk. The thickest part is called the trunk. And then this could be a limb, and that's relative. These coming off of here, you could say they start out as branches, but then as they thicken up, they could become limbs. And then there's a branch that comes off of a limb. And then here's some twigs at the very top. So these are terms, I would say they're relative terms based on size. Sometimes when I'm talking about insects, there's an insect that goes after the twigs because they're tender. That's where the new growth occurs. And so there's some called twig borers, where there's other insects that are called trunk borers. Or you'll see woodpeckers, for instance, drilling holes in the trunk of a tree usually. Sometimes they can get into the branches as well. But these are just a relative term on size of the tree limbs. Little thing on leaf morphology. Of course, the tip of the leaf makes sense. Sometimes that tip is going to have a spine, which could be used for identification. Sometimes it's going to be rounded. Here's a blade, like the blade of a fan. Then the veins. Here's the petiole that runs. Sometimes that petiole is short or long, and that's where it's attached to the limb or the twig. And the margin, sometimes the margin can be smooth or have little jagged edges. And here's the midrib. Sometimes these veins are, well, most of the time they look like highways, because there's the main highway, small road, there's where you live, let's say on the subdivision. So that's kind of the way almost all trees. Although if you're looking at ginkgo, for instance, you would notice that it has more of more of the veins would be parallel. There'd be several main highways going through. There aren't too many trees that have that kind of a system, but that would be a good difference between most trees are going to be looking like this. Some of the terminology, again, blades, leaf, whole thing is a leaf and then blade, midrib, petiole. Stipule are tiny little leaf types right by the, at the base. If that leaf was chewed off by an insect or an animal or taken off, that's where a new leaf would start out again from the bud. So let's say in the fall when this leaf gets old and it falls off, then it just starts, these buds may not pop out until the spring. So there's the bud right there. And a lot of times people can identify just by the buds. Some buds are pointy, other buds are round. Some leaves, here's one leaf, but here's one leaf too. This whole thing is a leaf because when it falls off right there by this area. The leaves don't fall off right here. When this thing falls off, it falls off right there. That's why they call this a compound leaf. So here's a blade again, and you can see this one has a jagged edge. Here's another axillary they call it, where if that one again fell off, then this axillary bud would be stimulated. There's a lot of hormones and chemicals that occur in a tree as well. We won't talk about those, but just keep in mind that the tree doesn't know unless something happens to that leaf. This is sort of the backup plan in that axillary bud. Again, this is a simple leaf. Here's a compound leaf. The axillary bud may be there. Here's a leaflet. But again, this whole leaf in the fall would fall off right here. They wouldn't fall off separately here. These are just leaflets. So here's different types of compound leaves. Again, they all both fall off down here, but this one has a terminal leaflet. This one doesn't. So that's just another, there's going to be quite a bit of different looks, I guess, styles of different plants and trees. Here's some compound leaves that really look different. Here you've got some, I should have a couple examples, but the example I use here is mimosa tree. Again, this leaf, or actually this is where it'll fall off right here, boom, down here. This whole thing is one leaf. It won't fall off at these sections, but it'll fall off here. And on the ground in the fall, you'll see this whole thing laying on the ground because that's where it dies back. Again, on this one, it's a palmate, like the palm of your hand. It's attached here. It's not going to fall off at these points. It's going to fall off there. So this means this is a palmate leaf. Now, leaf arrangement, if they're staggered, like one here and then it goes up on here and goes up over here, this is called alternate because it's alternating. Here's where it's opposite. It's just the leaves are opposite. There's the main point. They call it the node. And that's where it goes up to another node. And that's what happens. These leaves, when they fall off, they'll fall off there, they'll fall off there. Here's one where it's whorled. It means like every spot, the node is going to have, could have one or two. I mean, it has two or more leaves that follow it around like that at the same node. So just keep in mind some of the terminology that goes on with leaf arrangement. It's very important when you talk about identification. We'll talk about that in a second. Here's some alternate leaves. Here's a black cherry. You see alternate. One goes up on the other side, goes up on the other side. So those are alternate. Here's a magnolia that has that alternate. And notice the magnolia also has sort of a brownish on the bottom, green on the top. So just notice all these different colors and characteristics as we learn about how to identify plants. Here's an opposite arrangement. Oops. This is a dogwood cornice. It has opposite leaf arrangements. Here's that's what the arrow is for. For the final one is a whorl type in a white pine, and you can see there's 5 leaves or needles. Needles are the same thing as leaves that can occur at that one area, that one node. And leaves can have these different veins, basically. Here's the palmate veins. Here's really definite veins. They call it pinnate. Here's some that are more main veins. Here's that one I talked about that has parallel veins. Just different types of veins. And that could help you in identification as well. Now, seasonal pattern of how the carbohydrates, what that means is the sugars. Where are the sugars going? And this goes back to a lot of ways a tree survives in the wintertime. For instance, in number 1, you'll see right now, early spring, the carbohydrates, basically the sap, the sugars, are pulled up to the branches to prepare for leaf emergence. So all winter long, they were being stored down in the roots. In the spring, the leaves come out, the buds start popping, and so there's a respiration that happens. The tree starts breathing again better. It breathes all winter long, but even now it's going to breathe even more. And it's going to pull all those waters which are going to be full of sugars. Think of, here we're talking about a beach, but maybe use sugar maple as another example. Whereas that's when the sap is going to run and you can get sugar maple. You can harvest for the sugar, the maple syrup. So in the spring, when leaves are starting to emerge, the carbs are now depleted basically in the roots. They're going to be used by those leaves up in the tree. Midsummer, the tree is starting to replenish those depleted carbs. So they used up a lot of that energy to make more leaves. And in the summer now, they're starting to use those leaves. The leaves are orienting themselves to the sun and photosynthesizing. They basically turn the sun's energy into sugar, which is the amazing part of nature, photosynthesis. Late summer, the tree is just full of carbohydrates. So that's when it's the healthiest, usually. And in the winter, the carbs are stored in the roots, and then the cycle begins again and goes back into the spring. So this is a pretty good diagram and picture of how this all happens in just a tree. And it happens quite similarly in other plants as well. Trees grow by basically two different ways. If you had a tree in your yard and a branch was sticking out of that tree and you hung a swing on that tree, the question is that swing going to get higher as the tree grows? And the answer is no. The swing's going to stay almost in the exact same spot, because this is how a tree grows. It grows from the very top and it grows from the very bottom. So the very top has some words. That's where the apical, the very tip, and meristem means the growth areas. That's where the new cells basically elongate. Same thing for roots. Kind of the similar things go on with roots at the top. There is some in the middle where you see that picture right here. You see that there's some outer, think of this as the trunk of the tree. The tree is basically growing in this area, this outer area, this place called the cambium. And that's where it's growing thicker. So the swing, if it was if the swing was hooked on right here, the swing would stay there. Only the tree would get thicker. If you wrapped a piece of string around there, it would break that string pretty quickly. So primary growth occurs at the root tips and the shoot and the roots. Secondary growth is in the lateral. It makes the roots thicker and the trunk thicker, the branches thicker. So there's where it's at right there. And you can see the primary bud here usually takes off first. And if anything happens to that, then one of these other secondary buds will start. So there, this year's growth is 1 year. Let's see, they show 1 year growth right here. 2 years old. If you're thinking about fruit trees, this is very important sometimes. You want to know what this year's growth is. And 2 years ago, it was this. 2 years ago, 3 years old, 3-year-old wood is way back here. So that's interesting to kind of be able to look at a tree. Sometimes it's not easy figuring that out, but this is 1 year old side branch formed from an axillary bud near the shoot apex. So that can happen too. Once that takes off, this was, let's say, 2 years ago, and this bud took off, and also this one did too. It doesn't mean that if this one takes off, this one won't, but sometimes that one inhibits that one, or at least slows it down. So there's a lot of hormones, a lot of interesting things that are going on. If you cut this one, if you cut this branch, let's say down to here, then it's going to be shorter than this branch, and this one will be the dominant one. This one will take over, because there's something about a tree that when that happens, and you'll learn this if you take a pruning class, which we're not going to cover. If you want the pruning, if this was going into your house, for instance, so you cut this one back here or here, if you cut it back here, then maybe you wanted this branch to grow away from your house, or maybe out into the sunlight, versus this one that's more in the shade. You could think of this as an apple tree or a crepe myrtle, whatever tree you're trying to train. This is a good way to train a tree in your yard. Obviously, you can't do this for forest trees, but you can definitely do it in trees in your yard. So here's some of the parts of, there's buds, there's leaf scars, which means those were from last year. There's a stipule, means that's sort of the growth ring of that bud. Now the lenticels are the little breathing patches, you might say, on the twig. They're actually letting in some oxygen. And then if you could cut this in cross section, you would say often there's a different type of a twig. Some have uniform, what they call pith, which is a softer tissue. Some have more of a staggered, chambered pith. Some of it is hollow, and some of it has what they call excavated pith, little gaps in the pith. So that could mean sometimes when you're identifying trees, you have to take your pruners and snip a branch and look for the different types of pith. Not that often, but occasionally that helps. There's different buds. Whoops, let's look at that a second. You can see that the beach is very narrow, whereas, gosh, some of them have 2 or 3 little buds coming out. Some of the buds have a stalk, like they're in the maple. There's some have rounded like the ash. You can see where the bud scar, you can almost identify the tree just by the bud scar. Some of them have very prominent bud scars. So some of them have just one scale. So it's very interesting if you get into it very deep to identify trees just by the buds that come out. Roots are very interesting. You see, this is a good example of what roots look like under a tree. When I was in grade school, a guy came in and said, the tree is just like a mirror. the higher the tree, the deeper the roots. Well, that wasn't true. The roots are almost like, you could say it's almost like a pizza pan. They're very narrow, but they go out. They might go out almost as high as the tree is. So if the tree was 50 feet high, often the roots might go out that far. At least they're going to try to go out as far as they can go. But the deepness of the roots aren't that deep. They don't have a tap root like sometimes people have said. Maybe this was the closest thing to a tap root, but it bumped into a hard pan, one of those frangipans, and pretty much stopped. And then the roots went out far and wide. That's why if you see a tree that blows over in the wind or a storm, you'll just see a kind of a plate it'll look like, rather than very, very deep. Most roots are on the top 2 feet of the soil. Roots anchor the portion of the tree above ground. In winter, roots store food reserves. They consist of large perennial roots and smaller feeder roots. And large roots and primary branches increase in size and grow horizontally. The feeder roots are only about 1/16 of an inch in diameter, and they constitute more of the tree's surface area. So that's why I was talking about during the drought. The drought can often dry out those feeder roots, those hairs, and cause the tree to suffer. But then maybe they'll grow back. Same thing for a flood. Sometimes a flood can rot those feeder roots. The feeder roots grow out and up from large roots near the soil surface when the water and oxygen is abundant. And the major function of those feeder roots is absorbing water and minerals. So they're very necessary. You should be real careful when you're constructing something around a tree. Often somebody with a beautiful tree in their yard will think that they're far enough away to put in a house. They need to be, 20, 30 feet to make it more likely. Even then, just what I said, the tree's roots go out quite a ways. So if you put the house on one side, the sidewalk on another side, and your feeder pipes of water and electricity go in, so you could be ruining a lot of the roots that are around a tree, and that's why it makes it very hard to build around a very, very nice mature tree. It's better to put in the trees after the fact. A tree trunk gives the tree shape, strength. It actually has a great plumbing system inside the tree. And by that I mean different things that are carrying nutrients up through the tree, and tubes that are carrying things down. The ones that are carrying minerals and water up are called xylem vessels. And if once the tree has the leaves that have photosynthesis, there's little vessels that carry all those foods and starches down the tree, and those are called phloem vessels. Here's the cross section of a tree. You'll see that, let's point out some of these things. We got the sapwood, which is the growth period. Heartwood is that middle section. That's been a while. Sometimes there's a pith right down the center. These are growth rings, meaning that every one of these rings is a year. And you'll notice that here's what it looks like if you cut it kind of on they call it tangential. This is what a lot of our boards look like. When you buy a board at the store, it'll look like that. And then there's the inner bark and the outer bark. Here's a very, very interesting cross section. I've got a chunk of wood like this that I like to keep because in there the tree tells a story. You can see that there's where the tree probably started way back in the day. And you could count all the rings all the way out, and you could basically pretty much tell the age of a tree. But look at there now. Sometimes it was wider out to here. There it's very small, so that could mean where it was in the forest, maybe it was the south side of the tree, and it got more light, so it grew faster. let's see, B is it's growing fast, and there's even rings right around there. C was when something fell on the tree, and that made part of the tree grow slow, part of the tree went fast. D was there's shading going on, so then that inhibits growth on one side and helps it on the other side. E was their competing trees were removed, and then it started growing equally again. And then there was a fire. Maybe it didn't kill the tree, but there's the fire that caused it to be damaged. So you can either see a fire or an insect hurt the tree, or even somebody came in and bumped it in with a car, and maybe they put a nail inside of there. I've seen trees with nails on the inside, or someplace where they might have hit it with a hammer or something like that. That can cause that. And then narrow rings probably due to a drought, and then maybe an insect caused that problem too. So the tree can tell a story just by looking at that. Flowers of the tree, there's interesting, there's female flower parts. Here's the vessel that you can see, this fat ovary. That's where the new plant will be created. And there's a tube that leads up, it's called a style. And then there's some sticky parts at the very top of this vessel. And that's where the pollen is gonna go from, here's the stamen, that's gonna have the pollen. It's gonna get on this vessel. Let's see right here, here's the pollen, and it's gonna get on this vessel and go and grow down here, and it's gonna fertilize all the little eggs basically in that vessel, that ovary. And that's why you might look at an apple, let's say an apple, this is an apple leaf flower, which is very similar to this one. And inside the apple, if you ever open up an apple or cut it, you'd see five segments, 5 little ovaries inside that apple. And that occurs differently in all kinds of different trees and flowers. So it's nice to know these things when you're identifying or just understanding why your apple is deformed. Maybe one of those sections didn't get pollinated properly. Maybe there was something wrong. Maybe an insect chowed down on some of that pollen. A lot of different things that occur. But this is, again, this flower, they call it perfect because it has male and female on the same flower. And so you'll see that flowers have a mind of their own. There's all kinds of combinations. There's no such thing as one size fits all. Here's male and female on the same flower. Here's where the male and the female are on the same individual, but not on the same flower. So you see there's a female flower over here, there's a male flower over here, and doesn't necessarily mean that this pollen will make it over to this flower. A lot of times these aren't synchronized, and so the male of another tree will have to find the pollen will have to make it over to this flower. Like I said, there are literally every combination you can think of occurs in the world of plants. Here's when they call these are on separate individuals. So in other words, these are 2 trees that have one type of tree of the same species will have male flowers, and even maybe a holly tree of another type will have female flowers. So here's some of those examples: ash, black gum, eastern cottonwood, red cedar. There's our holly that we know of quite a bit. Sassafras, willow. I didn't know all these, but let's say holly, for instance. You'd buy the holly female because you want to get the one that has the beautiful berries. But then you might buy a couple males, or ask your neighbor, hey, do you have any male hollies? And if they do, then maybe you don't have to get a nearby male, because that's what's going to take to get those flowers and those berries to occur. probably, and who knows, it's hard to say for sure how far away. The closer the better, obviously. But if someone has male hollies in your area, and they have to be the right ones too. They have to be able to produce their pollen, open up, and the pollen has to be taken by bees, often, sometimes by just air and wind, over to the female. So that's what I mean. There's all kinds of combinations. When people say, why aren't my hollies, why don't they have berries? Well, it could mean several things. It could mean that there's no males nearby. It could mean that the bees aren't working very good. Maybe the wind didn't blow. And the red maple blows everything out the window. Some trees are entirely male, and they won't produce any seeds. Some are entirely female. Some are monoecious, bearing both male and female flowers. And this is called polygamodioecious. That's quite amazing. But it's not unexpected in the plant world. You know, we think everything has to be cut and dry in our world, but this is definitely not the way nature works. Here's true seeds that are produced by a flower. You might get fruits like an apple. You might get wings, seeds with wings, like this maple. You might get catkins. That's they're pods, like a red bud. You might get nuts, like a hickory or an acorn, or cones. There's different fruit types. You can see here, there's achenes. There's a name for every one of them. There's samaras. There's nuts, acorns, legumes or pods, capsule, a pome, that's what an apple is, a drupe, like a cherry, and a berry, like a strawberry. So there's different ones, and I think there's examples of, yeah, down below there's examples of trees of every one of those. Persimmon is a berry. That's interesting. So let's use some of the things, the skills or the information that I just showed, and go through about 15 to 20 trees and identify. Identification is important to get a good handle. And one way to identify, or let's go back in history, dendrology. I dug out the definition, and it goes back to the Greeks. It means tree, and the ancient Greek means study of, zoology, and maybe that goes back to that xylem. But anyway, it was wood, and it's a study of wooded plants. So taxonomy, usually when I took taxonomy classes, we were able to identify plants, but dendrology is basically trees and shrubs, woody stuff. And it's nice to have a book or two, field guides. You know, you don't need too many, because what you're going to do is either page through them and look for the trees that are similar. You might even do it by a key. Some books have keys, and keys mean, it's dichotomous means two, and two means that you're going to make a decision. You're going to make a decision, and they're simplistic. Let's say they're not necessarily simple to use. You make one decision at a time. One decision, and we'll talk about decision making. One may say it's a tall tree or a short tree. The guy who invented this system was Carl Linnaeus. He used a system of binomial. Again, it means two. And while the binomial is giving every plant, every person a name, like Acer rubrum would be red maple, or Homo sapiens would mean man. Let's look at an example. Oh, before we do that, I'm going to show you a couple ways that kind of makes things easier. At least it's made things easier for me, and I hope it makes things easier for you. In fact, I almost guarantee that if you are pretty good on your iPhone or Android, doesn't matter, you are already capable of identifying 50 to 100 trees and plants and fungi and mushrooms and birds. So you probably have already learned this already in one of your classes, how to use iNaturalist. If not, explore that maybe before we go out into the field on our walk around, because we'll use this quite often because it's, well, it's easy. It doesn't always give you the answer, but it really helps. It's helped me quite a bit. The other one is Google Lens. If you have an iPhone or, I don't know, Android, it's put out by Android folks, but it's also on your iPhone right there next to the line. You've got a little lens. You push that, and up pops their camera. You take a picture, and the picture automatically tells you what you're looking at. Again, is it perfect? No, but it's pretty close. And a lot of times it gets you on the right track, gets you on the right way of thinking. So let's practice a little bit. Let's look at this one. I think I've already kind of showed you what this was, but let's take it step by step as a dendrologist would do if they didn't know what it was. We see that it has a certain shape. It has a smooth outer edge. You see on the twig, it has alternate. One here, come down, one over there. So it's alternate leaves. And let's take this through. We know it's alternate leaves. We know it's a simple leaf. It's not one of those compound. So the first thing on our choices here is it's a compound one. Here's another one, leaf simple. So it's simple. Let's go down to the next one. Let's see, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 were already used up here. So 7, is there opposites or are they alternate? Well, we just said they're alternate. So we pick that one. Now we go down to 11 and 11. Is the leaf entire or does the leaf have lobes? Okay. Leaf has lobes. 1, 2, 3, 4 lobes. Now, are the leaf margin coarsely? Does it have serrated, which means it's jagged, or is it smooth? Now it's smooth. Now, the leaf has 3 to 5 lobes, or a leaf has 7 to 9. Those would be the oak trees down here. So no, it's only got 1, 2, 3, 4, we said. So it's going to be this one. 3 to 5 lobes. Now our choices then are leaf lobes are bristle, or are they just, where's 18? You know, lacking bristles. So they're talking about right here. Is there a little bristle, a little thing sticking out there? Nope. And so they're lacking. So 18, then next one is leaves lobed and entire. Or that means they have lobes. Some of them have lobes, and some of them are all in one. Which, if you know anything about sassafras, it has 3 different types. It has either 3, or it has all 1, or sometimes it's divided into two little leaflets or lobes. So it's in this case, they're always lobed with this one. And so one final thing, it's either going to be petiole, which is this little thing right here. It's either going to be pubescent, which means it's got hairs, or it's going to be glabrous, which means it's smooth. This one looks smooth. Sometimes it gets harder and harder as you get down through here, but we said it was smooth. So then finally it came out with tulip poplar, and that was the right answer. So you can see we had to make a lot of decisions right here. So, and sometimes if you make a wrong decision, you have to go back and figure it out. So it's not that easy peasy. But the way I like to do it was with my phone. if you guys want to get your phone out right now and take a picture of this, either with your iNaturalist app or with Google Lens, and then we'll see what if you come up with the right same answer. So if you used a key, maybe you got it. If you used iNaturalist or Google Lens, you might have hopefully all got it. I tried to use my iNaturalist for all the examples I'm doing today, and they came out top answer. And if you want to go into a little deeper, here's the tulip poplar tree and talking about all the cool things of a tulip poplar tree. That's the nice thing about either one. You can research a little bit more. You can look at the bark. You can look at the buds. You can look at the flowers. You might have to wait until the right season to see the flowers. That's why having different types of keys, sometimes you can get a book of buds in winter, where maybe iNaturalist, the photographic way, wouldn't work too well. But if you had buds of winter book, you might be able to figure it out quicker. You wouldn't have to wait till summer or spring. But anyway, you could read all about it. I like to read about the general issue, or general what the tree is alike. The tulip poplar is also called a white poplar or white bud, and it's a large tree. It's our state tree, basically, for Tennessee. It grows very quickly. It's easy to start, and the wood is valuable for veneer and other uses. Songbirds, game birds, rabbits, squirrels feed on the seeds, and white-tailed deer browse it. So you'd have to protect it if you had deer in your area, but it's usually a big, majestic tree. It's one of the first ones that turn a beautiful yellow in the fall, and it drops its leaves pretty quickly. But again, it's the tulip poplar, a very beautiful tree. Now here's another one, and use your book or an iNaturalist. And right away, you'll know that it looks like a maple tree or a maple leaf, which is a good way to start. Some of your knowledge is more than you think. And it has opposite leaves. You'll learn later that almost all maples, I don't know if there's any exceptions, have opposite leaves. So if you snap the picture, and red maples have a certain characteristic of lobes. You'll see in the next one, we're going to do sugar maple, and you'll see that there's differences. Somehow Google Naturalist picks that up. I think red maple has this red petiole. It could be the length of the petiole too. I'm not 100% sure on how that works. So, and the color changes of the red maple, probably more brilliantly than the sugar maple. But here's the beauty of a red maple. Let's go to another maple, and you see it looks quite a bit different. But I took a picture with my phone, iNaturalist, and it came out with sugar maple. So that's pretty neat. I didn't have to use my key book, which I think I was cheating a little bit. You should probably practice and learn how to do it both ways to a certain extent. But I'm not afraid. Just like when I was in school, everyone said I needed to use a slide rule, learn how to use a slide rule. But it's nice to know, but especially if you're out in the boonies. But sugar maple in general, it's also called rock maple because it has very hard wood. It's found on most wooded slopes. It's known for maple syrup, but the wood is also used for furniture, musical, flooring. Birds and rodents eat the seeds. So it's a pretty nice tree to have in your area. So here's another example. You probably right away could say oak. You'd be right, alternate. But which oak is it? And that's important to figure out. So take a picture right now and snap it and see if you can identify this one. If you said it was a northern red oak, you would be correct. It has 3 to 5 shallow lobes, coarsely toothed, light green So it has certain characteristics that'll make it a northern red oak. And it's one of the dominant forest trees throughout the state. It can grow very tall. Deer, bear, other mammals eat the acorns. It's made for furniture, flooring, railroad ties. So all the red oaks, this is very important, all the red oaks have the bristle tips. Right there, bristle tips. Whereas we'll talk about some of the other ones right here. See the bristle tips? Those are the red oaks. And the ones that are rounded are the white oaks. So there's a total of 20 species of natives in Tennessee. 8 of them are white oaks with the rounded lobes. 12 are red oaks with the bristle tips and the pointed. That's pretty cool to know. Also, the acorns, the white oaks are more bowl-like. They're deeper, I guess. The red oaks are more like a saucer, a little skinnier. I didn't know this. The white oaks mature in 1 season, while the red oaks take 2 seasons to mature. Then if you really want to get into oaks, which I think you should because there's so many in our forest, you can take pictures of this leaf, and right away you know that it's rounded, so you know it's going to be in the white oak family. But it's, you know, it's not, it's in the white oak family, but it's also not on its own. It's called a post oak. It's one of those. Same thing with a willow oak is a white oak, although this one doesn't look at all like a oak leaf. And I don't even know if iNaturalist would correctly identify this. You might have to shoot another type of picture and look at some of the other characteristics. Here's a water oak. That looks a little bit more like an oak leaf, and it probably should come out pretty accurately with your iNaturalist or Google Lens. Here's another example of a tree. You could take a picture of either one of these to see what you get. If you came out with dogwood, you'd be right. And this is the Cornus Florida. There's other types of dogwoods, shrubbery, but the tree is pretty specific, flowering dogwood. It has opposite leaves, and they look really kind of soft compared to oak or other trees, beech. But you could probably figure it out if you saw the flower. The flower has sort of a 4, like I said, they're not petals. The white flower or the pink could have white calyx. Here's another one. Now look at this. The veins are very, very straight. And the leaves have jagged edges. So those are going to be features that are going to make you want to page through. Looks like alternate branching, alternate leaves. So those are pretty much way to start out with. And this will come out to be American beech. American beech is abundant in the north. It's an important timber species. They're a very important source of food for wildlife. And it's a very handsome tree with that beautiful bark, especially if there's a large open area. Let's go over to the evergreens or the pine trees. In this one we see there's 5 leaves or needles in a bundle. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You can see they're all joined. They're in fascicles. There's a group of 5, another one, 5, 5, 5. And so you might occasionally count a 6, but usually you'll count 5 in each one of those. You might even have to look at the pine cone as well on some of the pines. There are several pines in Tennessee, but this is pretty much I don't know if it's the dominant. No, it's not the dominant, but it's pretty common. Eastern white pine. If you know anything about eastern white pine, it grows better in the cooler climates. It has trouble when it gets down to the Chattanooga area because it's just not made. Once it gets mature, probably 20, 30 years old, they tend to fall over because they just don't seem to be very hardy once they get to be a older specimen. And sometimes we're not even sure why that happens. We think it's because they're not, during a drought year, they'll suffer. And then over time, they'll go downhill. But they're a very valuable softwood timber. They're found in moist to dry areas. There's wood in them that are very valuable for deer and even porcupine. Here's another pine. You could almost identify it very quickly just because it has 3 needles versus the 5 for the white. And they tend to be very, very tall. And the leaves on a mature tree tend to be at the very tippy top. Sometimes you can use your iNaturalist photo feature to take pictures of the bark itself. That way you could come up with the answer maybe just by the bark. Sometimes I'll recommend taking a picture of the leaves and then the bark on another picture. Here's a picture of another one. I'll give you a little time to figure out what this could be. Very diagnostic, very important tree in our forest. It's the eastern hemlock, where the leaves are opposite. They're simple, they're lobed, they're coarsely toothed. Let's see. And in the spring or in the fall, this whole tree becomes like a brilliant red or orange. And we'll talk about the eastern hemlock and some of the things that are putting pressure on the eastern hemlock. It's generally a very, very long-lived tree. It's important for timber. It has tannic acid for leather, I guess. Rough grouse, wild turkey, and songbirds have shelter in the tree. The other one, this tree just loves the shade. So if you are in a deep forest, this tree could still be growing down by the river if there was a river going through there. It generally likes a little bit of wetness, but it just can do good in the shade or the sun. That one could confuse you maybe, but again, take your picture. You can see the little fruits on here. Looks a little different than the hemlock, or definitely different than the pine. This one is the eastern red cedar, which we talked about in the cedar glades and really all over Tennessee. Very important tree. It's in the juniper family, Juniperus virginiana. So there's 2. The mature leaves are 4 narrow rows. They're slender. Whereas the photo on the left is the needle-like pointed. It took me a while to discover or realize that they're both the same tree. It's just a different one, immature versus mature. Sometimes I'll see the little seedlings of the immature and I'll go, that's not a cedar. But some of it's aromatic. It's a nice tree for, using cedar for a lot of things. It's very resistant to decay. Here's one. You can take a picture. I kind of sidestepped the picture taking time. But this one is, again, a common one. It's you can see it's an American elm, and the way to tell an elm, of any kind of elm, is unequal. See, this one is attached a little higher, and this one loops down. When you see an elm or see a leaf kind of like that, that's going to be an elm. It has a jagged margin, and it's rough. Usually on the upper surface will be kind of rough. You'll feel like it's a kind of a little sandpapery. This one you may have known before, and this is the one that we were keying out. We got to the point where we want to count the lobes. This is the one that had either this is all the same one, but sometimes it's a mitten, sometimes it's got a thumb and a pinky sticking out, sometimes it's just one leaf. Take a picture of that and see what you get. You may or may not know already what this is. It's a sassafras, and sassafras is a smaller tree. It's let's see, green above, characteristics, 3 types of leaves. It can use for fence posts. It could be, there's a tea that you can make, sassafras tea out of the roots. Some medicines, perfumes, etc. are used with this. Every tree has a lot of characteristics, and that bark, if you took a picture of that bark, you'd probably get sassafras from iNaturalist as well. Very descriptive bark. Here's another one that's pretty interesting or easy to identify. Sweet gum. Sometimes we call them gumballs because of the fruit that you know, right away, if you see the gumballs, you know you've got a female tree. There are some male trees that do not have the gumballs, but it's really hard that I have known that hard to know ahead of time if the tree is going to be either female or male. But it's star-shaped leaves, pretty cool for doing leaf collections with kids. Get some tulip leaves, some sweet gum, get some of the other ones, and they'd have a great little collection. Again, the sweet gum, it's also known as red gum and sap gum. It's a tall tree. It's used for cabinet work, plywood, barrels. Pretty cool tree. Here's one that gives it away in the middle, hopefully. But maybe you don't know which nut tree it is. You look like, here's one leaf, right? Because that leaf comes away at the branch right there. These are all just leaflets. You can see it's alternate, boom, boom. So alternate down the branch. It's got hairy leaves, black walnut. You could probably scratch the wood too and smell the walnut branch out of it. It's made for sweet gum, or it's made for furniture, veneer, gun stocks, musical instruments. Very, very valuable wood out there. Here's the last one. This is a pretty descriptive leaf too. Look at that, a palmate leaf, but it's divided palmate. It's not a maple like a maple is. It's a horse chestnut. So this one has its own general characteristics, especially the very prickly capsules, spiny capsules. It's a shade and street tree. I don't know if I've seen it in Chattanooga, but it could be a good tree for that. Maybe not so great if these fell down on the grass and you had bare feet around, so that might not be the best for a street tree unless you're away from people. So this whole section was put together, I think, by Pennsylvania, and I thank them for doing that. So I've got a short discussion right here on tree health, which I think is important if you're going to study trees. In talking about tree health, there's fungus, there's bacteria, viruses, insects. There's other trees that get in there, and we call them invasive trees. Weeds can be a factor. There could be all the environment factor. We talked a little bit about that. And we talked also about the human impacts. Here's a great impact that occurred back in the 1904, somewhere during that era, where chestnuts were a dominant tree throughout the forest of America. You can see some loggers right here and how big those chestnuts were. They were as many and as big as all our oak trees are today. And they would harvest the chestnuts for chestnuts roasting on an open fire, those types of things. And along came a fungus and caused this, it got into the wood and caused a devastating canker on the woods. And you can see this is the place where all the chestnuts were all along, all the way from maybe New York, Canada, all the way down to Alabama, Mississippi. So it was a tree that's pretty well gone these days, although a lot of research is being done to bring back. I think they're getting it almost to the point where it's surviving. And it's not the original tree, the original American chestnut, but they've incorporated the genes from Chinese chestnut into it. And then they've gotten more of the American and less of the Chinese over time. So it's a lot of ongoing work that's that may bring back, or it has basically brought back, the chestnut. In the meantime, there's been places in the United States where it's kind of come back on its own. It's either done some crosses on its own, and just, I think in New York State and around Chicago, there are some places where you can go visit a forest and see some pretty nice big chestnuts, and hopefully they'll keep on growing. So lots of good stories about the damage and the recovery of these things. They used to be the king, and they made up 1 of every 4 trees in the Appalachian Forest. The wood is very rot resistant. It's very nice to work with for fences and furniture. And the nuts were very valuable to wildlife and livestock. Another problem, or another disease, was Dutch elm disease. This was one that occurred in the 1920s. They think it was imported from Europe for furniture veneer. And it's vectored by the beetle, elm bark beetle, that inserts the disease into the wood, into the vascular system. So you can see here's the tree, and it's got some leaves on one side, but it's dead really here. So that means some of the xylem, I can't remember if it's phloem or xylem. I think it's the xylem that the little fungi spores get inside of the vascular system and choke it off. Here's it shows that fungal blocking the vascular system. Here's a healthy tree. It's one of those trees that you could see from a distance how nicely shaped it was, a nice vase-shaped tree. They're used for cities where cars could drive up and down on the side and not even see. Right here, it used to be a lot of cities that had this beautiful tree, and then it started to lose branches, and the next thing you know, they had to cut down all the trees. And back then it killed 40 million trees, $2,500 a tree. That was pretty devastating. Now they've come up with, they probably aren't thinking that we're ever going to bring back elms to their glory, but there has been work that has trees that are disease resistant. Some are called Princeton, Valley Forge, New Harmony, and some of the ones that we have in Chattanooga are called lacebark elms, and they're also resistant to Dutch elm disease. So you'll see quite a few of these as street trees, and they're pretty nice. I like to look at those lacebark elms in downtown Chattanooga. There's rust diseases that can get on. These are diseases that you'll see almost every year, cedar apple rust, and that means it's on cedar part of the time and it's on apple part of the time. It's heteroecious rust, means it's got 2 hosts. It has the yellow spots on apple, gets the balls like this on cedar, and they go back and forth. In the spring, pretty soon, when it gets real wet, you'll see these fungus just sprout out like horns. They call them spore horns. This is how it works in the spring. The spore horns pop out of those little balls, and through the wind and rain and they splash on apple. They'll either even get on the fruit, and in the fall, the wind will take them back to the cedar, and depends on the weather and the conditions and everything, they'll infect the fruit or infect the cedar again. Here's a disease that looks bad. It looks like a big blotch on a maple. We call it tar spotted maple. Here's the fungal name, and it's they said it's sensitive to air pollution. I'm not sure what that means, if it's worse or better in air pollution, but it looks bad. It looks like that it's going to be damaging, but what we know about it, it's really not pathogenic. It's not going to kill the tree. It's just going to be cosmetic, more or less. So wouldn't worry too much. It's a curiosity, and it can get, I'm sure if it'll take away some of the photosynthesis on the tree, but not a death knell to the tree. Here's one called shot hole of cherry. It looks like you'll see these little holes. It almost looks like an insect was eating on it. But what happens is you'll see that it's either a fungus or a bacteria, one or the other or both, infect the leaf and cause the leaf to drop the center out. It'll drop the center on quite a few, and it'll look like someone took a shotgun and just shot the leaf. That's why they call it shot hole. And usually in the fall of the year is when the leaves start getting wet, and the fungus, if we had a wet spring, it gets infected in the spring and takes all summer long for the fungus to develop, and then it looks pretty bad, and then the leaves start dropping. Once it gets several spots like this, the leaves will fall off. So that's the nice thing about cherry, is that it'll give you that beautiful pink presentation in the spring. But then the bad thing about cherry is if it's susceptible, it'll do this in the fall. It'll drop its leaves pretty quickly. I don't know if there's that much resistance of trees like this either. Here's a disease, a fungal disease. They call it black knot. It only occurs on cherry and plum and maybe another stone fruit, but it's a big glob. And when this gets wet, there's tiny little structures that just ooze a bunch of spores out of each one of these little pimples that are on the black knot, and they'll fly off to another part of the host, and the tree can be covered all over with this. If you see a little bit of it, it's nice to cut out the branch to get rid of it, but in my opinion or my experience, often the tree is going to just have this on for a long time. It won't kill the tree, but it'll spread to the neighbors. That's probably where you got it. In the woods, you'll see it quite often. It might mean the tree is going to live a few less years, but you can't prune it out in a forest. But I've seen a tree covered with this and still producing nice leaves, and you wouldn't even see it after the leaves come out. Then you'll see some decays on trees. Either the tree has been damaged. Here's one called hypoxylon canker. Maybe there's another fungus that looks like horse hooves on a tree called the hoof fungus. There's one that can grow and cause a problem down in the roots or the base of the tree called a honey mushroom. So these are ones that can cause some on the side of the tree, can be different decay fungi. You could even try your iNaturalist for IDing some of these things. They're pretty good. I tried it on this one and this one. It does pretty good. This one didn't come out perfect, but I think if I worked at it a little bit, I could figure that one out too. There's lichens. You've seen lichens. They're just about every tree has these things. Some people think, oh, I've got lichens, I've got to scratch them off or power wash them. No, they're not harmful at all to trees. People think they are. They're a combination of an algae and a fungus, sort of in a symbiotic relationship. They're not pathogens. Let me get that straight. Not pathogens. They're interesting. There's so many different shapes and colors. It's just the beauty of nature. Some people say that it shows that there's non-polluted, that there's pure air in the area. So forests will have a lot of these. Lichens do not harm or cause injury. It can be a signal that the tree is in decline, though, from some other reason. So here's an interesting thing that one of my master gardeners brought up. For nearly 150 years, lichens have been a model of symbiosis. Now researchers have uncovered an unexpected third partner. I thought it was just algae and fungus, but there's also a skin or a cortex called that's made up of yeast or bacteria. He said it was bacteria, but maybe it's a yeast. Yeast and bacteria are pretty similar. So maybe if there's a third partner in there that I have to read up about. Then there's invasives. There's trees that we would rather not have, and where did they come from? They either got shipped in from some of our plants, or maybe they were plants that are known to be, we think they're good for our yards. Maybe they got carried in by people who didn't know any better. There's trees like tree of heaven, mimosa are widespread. All these things are pretty widespread around our area. These are trees. Then plants, Kogan grass. I haven't seen too much. I know it's widespread down in Alabama. Purple loosestrife over by some of the dams. I've seen that. Stilt grass. Multiflora rose is pretty popular, or pretty evident. And then kudzu. Kudzu, of course, not a tree, but it can damage our trees. And so that once it starts climbing up into our trees, we need to do something to pull it down. Same thing with poison ivy, which is actually a native, and some ivies, Virginia creeper. But my recommendation to get it out of the tree is just to cut the little stems going up the tree. Just cut them away from the bottom of the tree. Go in there and do that 1 year really good. Either do it right now before the tree gets, or before the kudzu or the poison ivy gets going. You don't want to be in there with all the juices going crazy. But cut it with some clippers. Cut an inch out so you can see which ones you got, or all the way around a tree, and then come through there every year, or even wait till midsummer. You should only have 1 or 2 that you missed, but make sure you get those, because you don't want this thing to get more energy as it goes up into the tree and becomes wraps up the tree and smothers those trees down. So those things are definitely problems with trees. Some insects that can be a problem. The alert here for some of the insects. There's more too that are coming. One is Asian longhorn beetle, emerald ash borer, hemlock adelgid. Here's the Asian longhorn beetle. We have not seen this yet in Tennessee, and it came in the New York area and Chicago's north side around 1996, 98, and we've been watching it for that many years. But the good news is it doesn't seem to be spreading away from there. We usually watch it come south, slowly or more quickly, but it really hasn't gotten out of this area. So there's high hopes that it won't, because it can attack somewhat in the neighborhood of 200 different species of trees. It's a beetle that drills or lays an egg, I think, on the outside of the bark. The egg catches, makes a hole in the tree, and then it's all over in a couple years. Here's one that we unfortunately found in Tennessee in 2010, and in 2013 we found it in Chattanooga. It came from China, Korea, who knows, but it's a beautiful little insect. It's not a beetle, but it's an insect. Not sure which. Well, it is a beetle, wood-boring beetle. Doesn't look like a beetle to me, but it's got mouth parts. It lays eggs on the outside of the tree. The eggs hatch into a larvae. The larvae penetrates the tree, and I think I got a picture. And inside the tree, underneath the bark, it makes these galleries. They call it winding tunnels. And sooner or later, probably about 4 years, the tree is dead in a doornail. Very, very. Now we can treat these trees with certain chemicals that get into the tree. A lot of the chemicals are either placed down below on the bottom of the tree, or sprayed on the bark, and it goes in almost like aloe lotion. And there's some chemicals that'll get in there and help basically save the trees that don't have it yet. It's very difficult to save a tree that's already got to this degree. Another problem of an insect is the hemlock woolly adelgid. It's native, again, to China area. It's been around since the 1920s. It seems like we've just recently had it. It's been more and more. Basically, each one of these little globs or styrofoam beads, they look like, is in a female. And inside one of those females, you'll see probably 20 little crawlers. At first, they'll be eggs, little orangish eggs. Then they'll turn into crawlers. And the little crawlers will start crawling. They're orange at first, and then there's a stage that's more black. And it just crawls all around the tree. You'll see this in the spring, so that's a good time to learn about it and get going on your treatment. It won't kill the tree right away. It takes a while for it to really kill the tree. So you've got a little time to work with in this one, but at least you should look underneath your branches. Most of the time it's going to be underneath. And again, it has the power to really engulf the tree very quickly. And I've seen this on lookout signal, even down in the valley now. It's just started to get into the valley around St. Elmo, but lookout and signal have it widespread. And it doesn't take that much money to treat it. You can, like I said, you drench the tree or drench the soil, and you can get pretty good control. There's kind of a picture of the female. You don't see the eggs, but they're in there. And it's in it's white cottony secretion. You might see holes on the tree. There's one that's a big hole caused by a pileated woodpecker, and there's a smaller one with the yellow-bellied sapsucker. The yellow-bellied sapsucker is the most common one. You'll see these holes going across. And of course, you can't do anything to these. They're protected species. And really, they're not known, in this case, yellow-bellied sapsucker, not known to kill the tree. I think in the woods, if it had this many holes, it could damage them. But normally we'll see 1 or 2 or 3 lines of this in our trees around our house. There's really not anything really of problem to this. I tell people just maybe put some burlap and discourage them from getting on the tree that you like. This one is probably being damaged to a tree that's already dead. They're just, they're going in, maybe it's on the way dying, and there's some organisms in there that they'd like to get at. But 2 beautiful birds that you try to stay on the good side of nature here. Some of the environmental factors to think about. We talked about some of these: the temperature, moisture, light, nutrients, pH, pollution, herbicides. Here's one called iron chlorosis that can occur if somewhat common in willows. It's caused by alkaline soils. Maybe the tree is growing real well. Sometimes it's just temporary. Sometimes it was too near where they put in a new parking lot. And of course, you know, the cement or asphalt, not asphalt, but yeah, the cement or the sidewalk asphalt can be more alkaline, and that can cause the tree to suffer from iron chlorosis. Water stress can occur. It happens quite a bit on dogwood in this case. You see the outer edges where the water is trying to transpire out of the leaf, and so it just can't make it out, and so it's leaf scorched due to drought stress. Sometimes coming out of winter, we'll see low temperature injury. Often, a lot of times, you know, it'll be warm in the winter, and you'll get some new growth. And then in the spring, we'll get this really hard freeze. We might get some of that damage happening right now because we're possibly getting some. We had 70-degree temperatures a couple weeks ago or last week. What was it? Now that stimulated new growth. Then we come back with a 20 or teens freezing temperature. It could cause some of this to happen. So if you had 1 or 2 trees in your yard, now would be a good time to maybe put a cotton sheet over it, not a plastic sheet, but a cotton sheet to buffer that tree to make it a little less chances of causing problems. They cause vertical cracks, from low temperature. They look like frost cracks because sometimes the trunk is coming out of dormancy and the water is coming up into the trunk, and then it freezes and it basically cracks that trunk, almost like a water bottle that you might put inside your refrigerator. It would push it out, and because the water is inside of there, it cracks the trunk. It shows primarily on the south or west side, because that's the side that's growing more, and it heats up and then it can cool down very quickly. Warm spell in January causes a tree to break dormancy, and then freezing in maybe April can cause that damage. It disrupts the vascular system, and it could be an entry point for insects and diseases. Here's a frost crack. On sunny days in winter, the bark warms up, the cells expand. When the sun sets, the temperatures drop quickly. The bark cools, contracts, and sometimes it does not cool very quickly, and it causes it to split. So temporarily, you could put a white piece of cloth around your treasured trees that would reflect that sun away from the trunk. Make sure you take it off though in the spring so that insects don't get underneath it. It would just be a cloth that would be very loosely tied around the tree, give you some protection. Some of the trees that are thinner bark tend to be maples, apple trees, and things like that. It would happen more readily. Sun scald, kind of the same, but occurs when the sun warms the bark on the southwest side of the tree. And again, when the temperature drops quickly, it leads to cell death and heat. Sometimes it's just straight out heat right on the tree. And again, those white cloths, there's some products that are specifically made for that can kind of wrap around a tree. They're made for insect borers and for sun scald, but you can do your own with a piece of sheet temporarily. Lightning kind of looks like the same thing, only the difference is when you see lightning, usually it's the tallest tree in the block. And if it's a big tree and it has this, you might not even see a really definite line like this. Sometimes the tree just dies unsuspectingly, and you won't really figure it out until maybe you cut the tree down and look at it. But basically, when a lightning strikes the tree, it's electricity that shoots through the tree, and maybe in a year or so, usually by the next spring, you know that tree had something happen to it. And then sometimes if we've got trees in our yard, or if we're spraying, usually it's trees in our yard that we're spraying the grass to kill the dandelions or kill the weeds. And some of the chemical will get it either on a hot day, it'll evaporate or somehow go up in the air. Or the worst part is if you put too much and it gets into the tree roots. Often you'll see curling of the leaves, but the tree will recover. If the tree doesn't recover, that means there was just too much that it could take in herbicide damage. And here's a good place, Tennessee. I've given talks to the Tennessee Urban Council several times. They're a great group, nonprofit group that tries to promote healthy, sustainable urban and community forests in Tennessee. Now I'm just going to have some fun here for the last 5 or 10 minutes. Talk about some of the trees that we see around, either around Tennessee. Well, these are Tennessee trees. There's different categories. There's historic trees, landmark trees, and different trees like that. Landmark tree must be recognized as an established and familiar tree of a community. So it might have been planted to commemorate a special event or community leader, but it has to be more than 50 years ago that that happened. Here's one up in the Hermitage, Andrew Jackson's estate up there at the Hermitage, Eastern Red Cedars. They were probably planted along the driveway, the carriage drive, a long time ago. I'm not sure if these got hit by the storm. They've had storms up there. So there's 6 large trees, and I'm not going to read it all, but the design of the driveway was created by Andrew Jackson's daughter-in-law, Sarah, and Ralph Earl. And so a tornado of 23 and 98 or 98 destroyed many of the original trees. So it's a lot of history that goes on here. Now there's also historic trees. Historic trees must have a direct witness to a historic event or cultural movement that was significantly nationally, regional, or within the state confirmed tree. So here's the Battle of Franklin, the Osage orange up at Carton Plantation. Beautiful tree. There's another picture of that. So it was a 1,400-acre plantation. It's where a lot of the, I think, 5 generals, here it says the disastrous battle resulted in the Confederates losing 14 generals. I think there were 7 of the generals that were on their deathbed in that mansion, in the porch or something like that. I lived up there for a few years and went to that mansion, a beautiful place to visit and read about not only architecture, trees, and the Civil War. That was a great major battle right down the road from there. Then there was the Battle of Nashville. There was the Basket Oak. I haven't seen that one yet, but that looks like an interesting one. So this was near Battlefield Drive, Granny White Pike. I know kind of where that is. So when Southern troops fell back, the Federals took possession of the house and converted it to a field hospital. So I like to read all the history that goes behind all these different trees. There's the Oakland's white oak. That was the occupation of federal forces, the Michigan infantry. And they were in battle with Nathan Bedford Forrest. And I guess they lost it and they surrendered underneath the tree. But then Jefferson Davis, they visited the site prior to the Battle of Stones River. And then after that battle, Murfreesboro returned to the federal control for the remainder of the war. Over 250 years old. There's a book out too, The Trees of Tennessee, or the Historic Trees, written by Mr. Gene Hyde, who used to be our Chattanooga City Forester. Very nice book. If you go to the Tennessee Urban Forestry, you might be able to get a copy of that or buy a copy of that. Here's a sycamore, huge sycamore. Well, Sycamore Valley Overlook Oak. It's an oak tree. Quercus alba. So it's a white oak. So another history here. There was a mill, black powder operations in the South. So always often associated with some war effort. So very interesting. The witness tree of Richland Country Club, again in Nashville. So in order to make one of these trees historic, you can nominate one of these trees, or you can, if you have a tree or you know of a tree somewhere on the land, you do the research and you know that it meets the criteria for historic tree or landmark tree, you can make a pitch to the Tennessee Urban Forestry and get that tree on the list. This is the witness tree. Here was present-day Nashville, downtown. Basically, they did a lot of their meetings underneath this tree. So used it as a shelter from heat and storm centuries ago, connected to the Cherokee Indians. Now here's the tree that's closest to our place, Bonnie Oak's Willow Oak. When I'm at work, I can look right outside and see this magnificent tree. It's in Chattanooga. It was added on January 16th, 2018. I think before that, though, it got nominated and put on the list as a historic tree. And now the gardens, if you want to visit the gardens and walk around and see the fountain, to the right there, you can see our building, and you can see that historic willow oak tree. You can also look at closer, and you can actually see where limbs have been falling off of that tree. We made a nice bench out of one of the limbs that's located over in that part of the garden. So we're trying our best, but you can see also that the tree is not structurally very good. See the limb going, or a trunk there, and there's actually a third trunk. And you can see some diseased fungi way up high in this tree. So eventually, and also if you look very up high, you'll see cables holding that tree together. So there's a lot of efforts being made to at least keep the structure the same. But if that tree falls, it's going to fall right on probably there's my window where my office is. So I'm hesitant, or I don't know if it'll ever fall in my time at working there, but it could possibly. There it is again, and I did a nice shot of that beautiful tree that I like to look out and just think of the memories, because this used to be an orphanage here at Bonnie Oaks. And actually there's been some older folks that show up and talk about that tree and how important it was and how much time they spent, and just learned a lot from their time at Bonnie Oaks Orphanage. There's some of the history. Dates back to 1854, was established. I think the orphanage went on to, gosh, into the 70s. And now there's a beautiful, Polly Claire's tea house there too, if you want to go to a nice restaurant. And then heritage trees. There's some of these, to qualify for an heritage tree, it could be a tree that has fallen, but it also has to have contribution to a history and heritage of Tennessee. So some of the former landmark and historic trees are now heritage trees. Here's a Chickasaw treaty oak up in Nashville. And again, a long description of what makes it, or what made it. It was kind of a sad story here. The chiefs ceded a large segment of the land south of the Cumberland River, much of present-day Middle Tennessee. That's a lot of land. So the tree became a campsite for many Tennessee soldiers marching off to war, and Andrew Jackson's campaign against the Creek Nation. So there's a lot of interesting history that goes on there. Said the tree fell in 1956, and even the bronze plaque was missing. So some of the other practices, we talked about the trees and we talked about how important they are, but here's many of the practices that foresters and landowners need to take to keep those trees in good condition and good harvest. They have to have good harvest. They have to replant. They have to plant regeneration. Maybe the trees are going to have natural regeneration, but maybe they have to thin it out or encourage it. Sometimes they have to fertilize the forest. If they're thinking about commercial timber thinning, sometimes they have to go in before, maybe at year 5, because they're going to harvest in year 10. At year 5, they have to thin it out. Sometimes weeds can start being a factor, so they have to go in and weed the whole forest. They have to maintain the forest management practices for wildlife. They might have to install water quality protection if there's a water body going through it or nearby. Maybe they just want it to be aesthetics for recreational, like a tree for a tree hunting stand, or they want to improve the diversity. They have to comply with some of the things of the Endangered Species Act. They have to also comply with the Clean Water Act. They just can't go in there and cause a lot of damage and expect to get away with messing up the environment. They have to take care of the invasive species if they can, to a certain extent. And they also have to be careful, as we very well know out in California and other places, they have to be cognizant of fire, and they have to do things that might help avoid fire in their forest. In summary, I want to say that from roots to leaves, every part of the tree is beneficial to us. Some of the benefits of trees I went over in another slide, but they're the basis of sustaining life on Earth. They absorb carbon dioxide and release oxygen to make by photosynthesis. They reduce soil erosion. They bind the soil to their roots. They absorb carbon from the atmosphere and store it in their wood. That slows global warming. They help nourish wildlife and provide shelter for thousands of species, provide nuts, bird, animals, and humans. They're natural air conditioners because not only around our house, but even in the forest, they provide that air conditioning, cooling for other things that live in the forest. Here's some more. They absorb dust and other pollutants. They absorb rainwater and keeps the land from flooding. They absorb considerable sound and help reduce noise pollution, especially in neighborhoods. Many trees have medicinal properties and are used in healthcare industry. They're used to keep us from getting, a lot of times, UV rays, and that might help us avoid some skin cancer. Trees are important in many industries of timber, paper, rubber, silk, helping economics of our country, or our Tennessee and our country. Here's some of the careers. I thought it would be interesting for young viewers of my talk to get some ideas of 50 tree careers. This is put out by urbanforest.org. And I was thinking about some of these, and some of them didn't make sense at first, like accountant or appraiser. And after a while, it made very good sense. You know, if you were a person that could appraise land, you might work for a company that has to be the accountant for a tree company. Some of them make a lot of sense, like botanical farmer, Christmas tree farmer, extension agent. Elementary school teachers should constantly be teaching these kids about trees. Forest pathologist with those diseases. Garden consultant. GIS professional. We hired a GIS professional to measure our pine tree forest down in Alabama. So that person was able to figure out exactly where the property lines are, which is very hard to figure out. And grant writer to save some trees, groundskeeper, a landscape architect, just all the way through here. Nature photographer. Wow, there's one that you could use trees as your primary focus. Park planner, professor, researcher, writer, all the way down through here. Tree inventories technician, tree service, all the equipment that goes along with forestry. So just a lot of things to consider there. So I want to thank you for viewing in or listening in. I enjoyed making this session for students and maybe for the Tennessee Naturalist Program. And if you have any questions, just get a hold of me. Have a great day.